I selected the Laura Bates Everyday Sexism monologue for my project. While I was listening, I sensed this notion of anger and sarcasm, as well as an attempt to inform listeners that sexism still exists in society. All three of these things influenced my decision for the direction of my visual personality, message, and goals. Here are 5 different examples that I was inspired by and influenced my direction for my visual personality. In this first example, I was super into the visual style of this animation. It was simple blocks of color and basic geometric shapes that when put together make more complex visuals. I'm not an illustrator by any stretch of the imagination, but the basic geometric shapes look really clean in this animation. The next example, I really like the transition between the segments of animation. I think the bright color in the background is working well. It definitely looks better than something like boring black and white, and it was really engaging. And the contrast between the shapes in the animation and the background are working really well here also. In this next example, I wanted to focus on the moving blocks of color in this animation. What I thought worked really well was the way these moving blocks of color moved the viewer throughout the animation. It looked like the animation was actually covering significant distance, which I thought was really effective throughout this entire segment. In this monologue, I think there are some really good places for the type to be what tells the story rather than a graphic or some other type of visual. In my research, I was trying to find an example that I would use as a foundation for my own animation. This next example of kinetic typography helps convey the meaning of the words using just the letters that make up that word. In addition to letting the type be what tells the story through this monologue, I think there are some places where there's some potential to add words and graphics that are not directly mentioned in this monologue. Specifically where Laura Bates states that women aren't facing real problems. My initial reaction when listening to this was to list all of the problems that women are still facing on the screen. But I wasn't sure entirely how fast I could list all of those examples and they would still be readable to the viewer. This animation in this example of how fast type can appear and disappear on a screen really helped me figure that out. Laura Bates' message in this speech is clearly a call to action, a reaction of anger and frustration, and informative all at the same time. Here are 5 different examples that I was inspired by and influenced my direction for my visual message. In this first example, my initial reaction to watching it was so bold. And I think that Laura Bates' message in her speech was bold as well. I think the contrasting colors contribute to that in this animation. There are sharp entrances, the contrasting, almost vibrant colors in the background all work together to create this bold and energetic feeling throughout this animation. In this animation specifically, I was really drawn to the different perspectives that the viewer sees the subject from. Straight on, over the subject's shoulder, and even from behind the viewer's glasses. The perspective really makes it feel like a complete story is getting told. I think this relates to Laura Bates' speech because she is clearly presenting a different perspective than what everyone else thinks is going on. Laura Bates' message throughout her presentation is clear. There are foundational parts of our society that contribute to everyday sexism. In this animation, you will see the construction of 2 different structures. I really like the way this is put together. I like the way that all of the pieces come together to make something. This visual implies that there is a foundation, that the parts at the top cannot be constructed without the parts on the bottom. Laura Bates is trying to reconstruct this foundation, and I think that this animation really relates to that subject. This next clip is actually from the same animation, but I think this entrance of elements helps get a lot of information on screen and presents it in a chronological way. I think Laura Bates jumps around in terms of the things that she talks about a little bit. There's not a direct connection, and I think that it's important that the viewer gets one established. So I liked the way that all of this information, as it showed up on screen, it was connected to the things that came before it. It was connected to the things that went after it. I thought that was really effective. In this animation, text is balanced with visuals. You're not reading too often, or you're not just only looking at pictures too often. I think this is important in an animation in this animation as well as my own because I think it helps the viewer look at different kinds of visual information. This was something that I wanted to use in my own animation, and you see here that when it's used properly, it can be very effective. One of my main goals in this project is to visually convey the entire story that Laura Bates has summed up in a 60-second audio clip. Here are 5 different examples that I was inspired by and influenced my direction for my visual goals. In this animation, while the subject matter clearly has nothing to do with our project, I really liked how they put the graphics into frames, and then those graphics broke out of those frames. I think this really relates to what Laura Bates was talking about in her own monologue. A goal of mine with this project is to give the viewer a complete story with the text already being laid out for me. That is one of the things I really liked about this next animation, was that it told a complete story. It carried the subject through the entire thing with smooth animations and transitions throughout the entire animation. This next clip is really short, but in this next animation you'll see the counter run up really quickly in value. I think this would be a great way to visualize some of the statistics that Laura Bates used in her monologue. I think they carried so much weight in her argument that it's definitely worth finding a way to convey those visually. In this next animation, there are individual motion graphics that are moving all at the same time that all make up parts of a connected whole. The individual motion graphics could stand alone, but they all seem to work together as well. This is an additional goal of my animation for my Laura Bates project because I kind of feel like she jumps around a little bit and there needs to be a way to establish a connection between each point that she makes. In this last animation, I just really liked the way that data was displayed. It was interesting, it was dynamic, it wasn't simple Microsoft Excel pie charts and graphs. The data still managed to fit in with the style of the animation. I think this is really effective, and this is totally something that I want to do in my own animation. So as you can see, I'm super inspired by a ton of different things that have different illustration styles and different goals and different messages, and I'm hoping that I can use some of, or if not all of these pieces to kind of create one balanced animation that conveys the story that Laura Bates is trying to tell.